What's up, guys? Welcome back to Roensch Capital Charts. Today we're taking a look at advanced micro devices, AMD stock, ticker symbol AMD, on a variety of time frames in anticipation of the next trading day, Monday, February 26th. Well, you guys, AMD stock on Friday finished the day down $5.34 a share, 2.94%. Listen, it is slightly down after hours, less than $1 a share. Understand, you'll hear me say this a lot. After hours, always take it with a grain of salt. See how you can barely even see any volume there in the after hours? That's going to be the culprit right there. It's very easy to push these stocks around after hours, and they're very thinly traded, they move very quickly, so unless volume is equal what it was in the regular trading hours, which you'll typically only see on like an earnings event or something, take after hours absolutely with a grain of salt. But let's start with AMD here on the 1-minute chart. Just want to take a quick look at this first half of the day. By the way, listen, if you guys enjoy or get value out of me covering AMD stock, I'm happy to do so every day and add it into the rotation. This is one of my favorite companies, one of my favorite stocks, really has been for years. But I need that feedback from the audience to see if this is something you guys would like covered on a daily basis. So please let me know in the comments section, and if there's enough interest, I absolutely will, and feel free to subscribe to the channel. My goal is 2,000 by market open on Monday. Now, what are we doing here on the 1-minute chart for the first half of the trading day? Well, I mean, you guys know, this video is geared toward looking at AMD come Monday's trading day, right? From a day-to-day perspective. But I'm also a scalper at heart. Scalp trading is what I do intraday every day. So I'm always thinking about how can I generate revenue in a particular security around a core position. All right, trading around a core position is very common practice in the industry. And I just wanted to point a few things out. So first of all, unless a stock is in play, meaning there's a fresh news catalyst, elevated relative volume by 3 to 5 times is typically what I'm looking for, there's very minimal edge unless you get very specific setups. Okay, I won't get into all that right now. If you guys want to get my scalp setup alerts, I just alert my personal scalp setup alerts that I'm watching as the day goes on. Take a look at that first link in the pinned comment. I think it really helps traders who feel like they might not have a sense of direction start having an eye for example, like what I'm looking for in a setup throughout the day. But let me show you something here on AMD, just really quick, and then we'll move on. You take a look at what's going on here off of the 20 EMA, for example. A lot of traders will look at this setup and say, oh, I'm going to short off that 20 EMA. Very minimal edge. Okay, extremely minimal, because AMD isn't in play. And EMAs, I have found, only have significant worthwhile trading edge, at least for retail traders, on stocks that are significantly in play. There are very few setups that do have edge on basically any old stock on any old day, because the setup itself, if it presents itself in a very clean way, has significant edge on its own. Okay? We didn't get any of those on Friday on AMD, but like a repeat offender setup, for example, that's a setup that I'm looking at. So I'll be watching that come Monday here. AMD is a common stock that I will trade that setup on. Let's move on now from the intraday mentality away from that and to a more day-to-day mentality heading toward Monday. Starting here with the 5-minute chart, I want to look at volume. This is a routine that we do on every stock that I cover here on the channel every day. I'm looking at the volume profile in relation to the movement of the stock to see, okay, was there any obvious bias from a big sample size that we can pull out of the market? So really, it's really not that difficult here. It's relatively simple. What we're looking for is big spikes in volume that occurred right around massive, obvious moves in stock price. And actually, interestingly, here on AMD, we have the contextual first volume candle here off the open. We expect that, right? We expect big volume. And we actually did see slightly elevated volume on this move downside, and then a little bit again here on this other move downside. Bulls, just understand I'm also taking note of this, right? It's just one factor of many, okay? But just understand that this, in the psychology of the bears, and I think it's always important to try to understand the quote-unquote enemy as best as we can, the bears are going to look at that and say, okay, that's good. All right. But then, the consolidation into the close it might put a dagger in that confirmation for them, but understand that they're going to look at that volume profile and say, okay, you know, we kind of won that morning. Just understand that, bulls. But let's move on here now to the 30-minute. This is where things start getting good. These are the levels that I'm paying extremely close attention to come Monday. First of all, because they're psychologically obvious and they're self-fulfilling prophecies. All right. We are right between, on the 30-minute chart, the two obvious indicators that everybody uses and everyone makes decisions around, the 200 period and the 50 period moving average, the gray and white lines respectively. So listen, here's what I'm looking at from a bullish perspective on AMD come Monday. Any test of that gray line, the 200 period, I want to see a hard bounce off of that level. Any upside test of the 50 period, that white line, I want to see a breakthrough, retest, and hold as support, and then a pull away. Okay, ideally really up toward those, or through that 183 and 183.50 more so, 184 region up toward 185. Bears, any upside test of the 50 period, you're going to want to see a hard rejection, and any test of that downside, any downside test more so, of that 200 period, going to want to see a break downside through and continuation, reclaiming that as resistance, or at least psychologically on the 30-minute in particular. All right, the 4-hour chart here, you can see that the 50 period, that white line, is very much so in play. So here's what I'm looking at. It's very simple, all right? Any downside test, bulls, want to see a hard trampoline-like bounce. All right, bears, but really your primary goal on the 4-hour, get down through the 50 period, retest it, claim it as resistance, all right, and then continue with a fade downside, ideally on as much volume as possible in really both the bullish and bearish case. All right, now let's move on to the most important chart of all, which is the daily. Okay, what I actually want to do is zoom out. Let's go to like really zoomed out here. You can see that all-time high is right at 184.92. Okay, so we come back to the daily and then we zoom in. Things are getting they're heating up on AMD. Okay, now to me, you know, you look at the daily and it's like, well, that 50-day really isn't incredibly relevant. At least in the near term, it's at about 158.90. Okay. When the daily, this is really important because the daily chart is so heavily watched that we have to look at this and really kind of dumb down our thinking, okay? And think, all right, what's everyone thinking? What is the obvious story here on the daily? And that's all I want to be thinking about. The more, I think this is a common misconception about TA, and this is my belief. You might disagree. That's okay. To me, this is all a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? And I mean, I don't want it any other way. That's exactly how I want it, because that we can have edge, at least as retail traders, if that is the case, which I believe it entirely to be. We have to look at this and say, what's the obvious story that everybody's thinking when they look at this daily chart on AMD? Well, to me, it's really clear. You have a few psychological levels and the all-time high. So I'm looking from a bullish perspective. Do not give up 175 to the downside. Ideally, reclaim 180. And use 180 to push us up through to 185 and claim an all-time high. Get above 185, that would be beautiful. Bears. From a bearish perspective, I look at this and I say, well, I wouldn't want 185 getting claimed, of course. Ideally, I don't even want that to come into the conversation. So let's see 180 act as a psychological resistance area. And really, for protection, let's get down through 175 and head down toward 170. Because really, you know, if I'm a bear, I'm kind of looking for, I'd prefer to see a retest of the 50-day here, which requires us getting down through 170, of course. All right. Now, let's take a look at the bias that occurred in the options chain. Like, what's the bias of the options traders back from Friday? This is all just data from Friday. Good sample size. Over 1 million total contracts traded on Friday. 644,000 of those were calls. 372,000 approximately were puts. So we are seeing relatively heavy call side bullish bias from Friday, which is interesting, but we're not done, right? We can actually break this down by time frame if we get a little clever here. Look at the delta range. 0 to 20. What does that tell us? Those are those far out of the money contracts, which on average have a much shorter average expiration cycle than these longer deltas or the higher deltas, right? So, the short-term speculators, what are they thinking? 257,000 calls, 141,000 puts. Again, pretty heavy call side bias here on AMD, right? Now, you go down in each delta range, you can see here, call heavy, call heavy, call heavy, call heavy. Every single delta range that's out of the money, at the money, in the money. So on average, short-term, mid-term, and longer-term sentiment, they're all leaning to the call side here on Friday, leaving us with a pretty heavy call side bias overall call-put ratio from Friday. But listen, as always around here, make sure your risk is absolutely managed. Very, very important to stay in the game. No one trade is worth knocking you out, and the options traders, of course, they can be wrong. So listen, if you got value out of this, let me know in the comment section down below, and please subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you in the next one.